So we're finally moving on to your assignment. We had to write the essay on the counter free trade arguments. So we're going to look at these four topics. It's important for your assignment that all four of these sections appear as a reason against free trade, a reason for protectionism in a sense. Um, the first one, which discusses infant industries, that needs to at least be a third of your work, because that's where the bulk of information is. The other three is very short. There's only like maybe 2 3 lines you can write on, maybe one paragraph to write on it, depending on how you explain it. And I'm not really looking for the graphs from this. You're not obliged to draw any other graphs. It's just the understandings that you need to know from here more than anything else. You are welcome to put in a graph or two for some of these arguments. Especially some people like to explain the learner curve or the graph. You're welcome to show that, but do not let that be the argument for 2 3 paragraphs. Show the graph, say this what the graph means in 1 or 2 lines, and that's it. If you want to put it in and yeah, I gave this essay probably in the model test and exam for the last 3 years. Always, it never skipped any of these. This is something I thought was like important because it kind of explained why we needed to look out for the developing countries and that, why they should have reasons for protecting their industries in a sense. Anyways, let's move forward. So, firstly, definitions. Important to show definition. What you will find is that there are multiple definitions. It's for you to pull one definition and show it. So that will be in your first paragraph. After you write your introduction, that discuss what infant industries is. I want to see a definition. Some people might put it in the introduction, but just let it be the only definitional kind that appears. Introduction was something like this would have been you start discussing something, and then in that introduction, you need to say, I'm going to be discussing these four reasons for arguing against infinite trade and against free trade, and you mention the four things, and then you start a new paragraph discussing the first part, and you do a few paragraphs on it, then you start a new paragraph discussing the second reason, and then you do a third paragraph discussing the third reason, and so on and so on. I need to see like how you structure and what you're saying there needs to be clear. I find that some people try to explain too much the technicalities on graphs, and that's not what I want to see. So at this stage, I have not looked at your assignments yet. And once I mark them, I will definitely give you better feedback on how you approach this and if you approach it in maybe the ways that I suggest here. Okay, so on to the topic, infant industries, protection to protecting the infant industry. So it's a short-term measure utilized to natural. So it's a, sorry about that. It's a short-term measure. It's only temporary in a sense, and you're trying to naturalize your industry against the foreign industry. So you want it to be able to handle the conditions that the foreign industry has and circumstances um, of the foreign industries, or in essence, the competition that they impose on your local industry. Another person says a part of this that is discussed that you need to know is that sometimes in the production process, being the first person in the industry usually gives you advantage against another person or another firm. So here, countries that existed before and were already in the market and that they are existing, and their superiority just because they started this production earlier than you. So in essence, you want to protect your industry by imposing imports on the foreign goods or on the same good that is entering your market to allow you to catch up to this process. So it will help you to build on your skill levels and your experience, and then eventually you will gain equal footing. Then you're competing on equal footing, and then it's up to which company is run best or improves best, or yeah, whatever happens between in terms of competition between these companies and that. So this is the learner curve. This year on the y-axis is your average cost. This year at the bottom is your total production over time. So it's accumulative production over time. So if you produce 300 goods in month 1 and next month you produce 350 goods, so roughly speaking, then every month you average 325 goods. You're not looking at your average, you're looking at your accumulative. So you, in essence, your accumulative would mean adding all the months and all the years together. So this is what this is trying to say. Another way you can see this is that over time. So as time goes on, you're producing more and more and more. So you will see some of the learner curves will have time here at the bottom. It doesn't really matter. Same thing as having accumulative or total quantity of production over time. Adding every production that you ever produce up till that point. So this graph is downward sloping, showing you that over time or as total or cumulative production has increased, your total or average costs have decreased over time. So that means your production processes become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So that means as you're producing more and more and more later on, those costs are dropping, and then because your cost is not going to drop for the initial production, those are set. You at the beginning would have had high costs. Then over 3 months' time, maybe that lot or that production you're making for the month would be cheaper. But when you add all the production over time, then your costs would have averaged lower because your newer months and your more latest productions would have been cheaper in that sense. So take away from this, average cost decreases as cumulative production decreases or as time goes on. So what you're trying to say is when you protect, you're curbing your foreign producers from jumping into your market. We're assuming now you're starting to produce this good. You want to stop any type of other or the same product from entering your market until you're able to establish your own local production of that good in your domestic market. So what that does is then it allows your domestic producers to increase their market share and increase their total output more rapidly without the competition now that you're facing from the foreign goods. It allows you to catch up them over time. So what that means on the curve, you could have found company, the foreign company being producing at Q2 already, and you come into the market and you producing at Q1. So your average cost was a lot higher, while this firm's average cost was a lot higher. I mean a lot lower because they've been early in the market. So by now curbing them, you're allowing you to move faster down this line, and especially because of the type of curve, the gains at the beginning in terms of reduction of average cost is a lot more is is a lot more than at the end of this curve. So here your gains in terms of average cost is a lot less. So when you're getting this aid of protecting yourself against the foreign firm, you're gaining a lot faster, and you can only gain a little bit because the gains are lesser again. And you're preventing from getting any more additional gains by curbing your market from the foreign firm. So in essence, then you might not exactly catch up, but you get close enough in terms of catching up to the other opponent. And it's possible that you would have gotten more gains if there was positive spillovers. So what we mean by positive spillovers, these may be close relationships between industries. So there's inter-industry linkages that in spreading knowledges, that stimulates innovations and allows to align innovators and the users of innovators. So you have this market link in that where you can spread knowledge between the industries. That whatever one industry learns, it could be used in another industry. Some type of technology that can spread between the two. And another way you can also gain is that when you jump into this production process, when your company starts off on that and you have this protection, is if your wages and your rent and all your cost initially is lower than other firm. So you employing cheaper labor in that sense. And this firm who's been a while in the industry can't compete with your labor, so you're gonna gain. The thing is, you still have other costs that will probably be a lot more at the beginning. So unlike the other firm who's been in the industry, you need to have bought a lot of fixed cost related stuff. Like you needed to buy maybe the land. So those are huge ass costs that's gonna occur. You need to buy the buildings. So there's a lot of costs that you have initially that you're not gonna have later on. But what you might have an advantage is that okay, I'm not gonna pay as much for my rental, or I'm not gonna pay as much for my wages, or my factors of production in not factors of production, but your electric costs, your water resources might be cheaper in your country. So that helps you gain in that. So what that means in essence that according to the curve, your curve is lower. So it's below this curve. And it's gonna allow you to catch up faster than in that sense. So some people might argue and say, well, according to the learner curve, as you produce more, the costs are gonna decrease, huh? So then why do you need to protect your industry? Because automatically by producing more and as time goes along, you're going to experience this reduction in costs. Isn't that enough incentive already for you to jump into the market? You don't need assistance. Things are going to get cheaper. So why do you need this assistance? You don't need the real protection in that. But then there's a side to this, as some people argue, that even though things are gonna get more cheaper in the future, and generally speaking, in a lot of these type of industries, most of the profits are made after many years. There's large profits to be made, but that exist many years down the future. Now that means there's a huge amount of risk until you reach that point where you're gonna get this lower cost and this huge profitability in it. And so for many people, that's a problem. You have a huge risk in getting these large profits which exist. So you don't know what's until only you reach that point where you're gonna get this profitability and this lower cost. You want some assurances. No one wants to jump in industry and says, okay, in 10 years time you're gonna get this hell of a lot of profits. It's gonna be 3 times your return that you would maybe 100 times your return, whatever. It's gonna be a hell of amount of return. You're gonna get in the industry and a whole lot of profits. But for now, you're gonna get negative profits, or you're gonna get losses in that. No one wants to jump in. And some people want assurances in that. And usually speaking, if there's larger risk, and then the cost of capital is also very expensive, and in that cases, investors don't want to jump on board. They're not willing to take this risk under this situations and that. So that's why then people argue we need some form of protectionism, some help and assistance that's going to guarantee us to get to that point of profitability and that. So let's talk about some of the issues with infant industries. So in essence, in the standard way that trade looks at your profitability, there's more profitability in the manufacturing industry than there is in the primary industry, like in agriculture and that. And as most industries have started over time, is almost everyone starts on the agricultural side and then transitions into the manufacturing side. So they start somewhere in the primary sector and then somehow they move out into the manufacturing sector. They start there somewhere. That's a normal transition. As your country is growing and growing and growing and growing, you transition to that process. And that's something you will read about, and it's going to appear in the last slide here or somewhere, that you need to go, you just need to go and read about. So that's the first thing. So understand that when a developing country jump in the market, it's primarily going to be in the primary industry, and it's not in the manufacturing industry. Is that an issue? Not necessarily, right? But if you only growing your agriculture industry at the beginning, and all the other foreign firms that is growing in the manufacturing industry, they are growing faster than you, because that is where the real growth is, or where the terms of trade is favoring. So then in essence, this developing country whose primary industry needs to grow in order for the country to grow and then to lead to the manufacturing to grow, they need this primary industry to survive. So this is now the argument on why we need protectionism in that. But as I said earlier, the terms of trade for primary goods is not really great. Over time, the terms of trade is favoring more and more and more the manufacturing sector. So what some countries want to do is start immediately in the manufacturing sector and stay away from the agriculture sector, which is very, very, very difficult to do, because that is not how standard trade models, how standard growth models discuss trading instance. And especially in Africa, a lot of our trade initially is in the primary sector. This is where we're sitting. And this is growth is what we need to allow ourselves to grow. But in the terms of trade, and yes, by now you should know terms of trade is the pricing, and the pricing is favoring the manufacturing goods and not the primary goods. Then how are we going to grow as a developing country if this is where we're sitting? So it's difficult for us to catch up in that sense. We've also then, there's this other dilemma sitting. Even if developing countries do manufacturing goods, all those developed countries manufacturing goods, terms of trade is favoring them for some reason. We can produce similar goods because in manufacturing goods, the goods are very similar. There's little small tweaks or difference between goods, but the terms of trade also favor the manufacturing goods of developed or first world countries over developing countries. This is what the developing countries are facing. So this is, if you need to remember what I'm trying to say here from here, is the two things you need to take away from this is terms of trade of the manufacturing goods is favoring manufacturing goods over primary goods. And developed countries find themselves more in the primary goods sector. Then, even if these developing countries had manufacturing goods, the terms of trade is favoring the manufacturing goods of developed first world countries than the developing countries. That's a twofold problem that developing countries face. And this is even though productivity has been quite good in developing countries. So I don't know when this paper was written and that this is taken from, but this is probably 2010 and earlier. So I'm not sure how the growth has been over the last 10 years. And the other problems that we see that Africa faces, that we will see later on when we do regional economic integration, and that is that the structure of trade, finances and services, the market regimes, and the size of economies have been not so great for developing countries. So those are some of the issues that they face. So let's move on to the idea of tools of trade. So we're trying to say, okay, we can impose some protectionism, and there's some way you can actually impose protectionism if demand and supply were of a certain form or at certain conditions. So if demand and supply at certain conditions, then you can actually impose some form of protectionism. Okay, so what is the first thing we discussed? We discussed infant industry, protecting the industry. Why protecting the industry? Allowing this industry to catch up with another firm. It's so far behind lagging. We're also trying to protect this infant industry because it's usually in developed countries. And in terms of developed countries, the terms of trade is not favoring them because firstly, they have a primary good. And secondly, the manufacturing good is also not being favored by the terms of trade. So this is some of the short summaries you should have picked up from earlier. Then now we're moving into terms of trade and we're moving away from protecting the country. We're saying, okay, under certain conditions for supply and demand, we can impose a tariff, or we can protect this industry in a sense. We can impose a tariff. Um, so you think of a tariff being like an indirect tax. We can force this pricing or our tariff to fall away from our country and onto the foreign good. So how do you do that? So the first thing is you need to be demand to be elastic. Why do you want demand to be elastic? What does elastic demand mean? If prices change, demand is going to change quite drastically. Alright? So what you want to do is if there's any price change or any tariff change and you're forcing it onto the foreign good, you want demand to shift away from the foreign good to your local good. This is why you want demand to be elastic. So if demand is of a certain form and supply is a certain form, you're shifting the demand quite drastically away from the foreign good. That's the first thing you're trying to do, right? This is what we're aiming towards. Okay. So demand must be elastic. And then we need supply to be inelastic. Why do you want supply to be inelastic? If something is inelastic, when you make drastic changes in prices, we don't want the supply to change in any drastic way. So you don't want to end up being, okay, this foreign firm now retaliates by this indirect tax or this tariff being imposed on them and they feeling the bulk of it, to move away from the industry in terms of the supply and then causing any changes in terms of the world pricing and that. So you don't want that to occur. So why would a firm have this inelastic supply? So there are two possible reasons. The first reason is the market is important for them. So for them to just shift the supply away somewhere else and go somewhere else might affect them badly. So this good is important for their country's development. And then the other idea is that this good is produced on significant economies of scale. Meaning they can produce this good very, very, very cheaply. So this pricing of changing of imposing a tariff on them might not drastically affect them because of what they're producing at, because of the economies of scale. So then effectively by you imposing this tariff, you are changing the terms of trade to favor your domestic country more. Only if supply is of this form and demand is of this form. How realistic is that into the real world? That depends on studies on how your elasticity of your demand and supply for this product is, and that is something that's going to have to be researched in order to determine if imposing tariffs on this is going to really change it. When we look at country like China, the economies of scale because of the cheap labor and that. Even if you impose tariffs on their goods, it's still these goods still flood the markets and that. So it's something of a very, very cheap good and very cheap costs and the economies of scale that is helping them still to bring their product into a country now. Anyways, 15.5, which is a graphical explanation, is for you to go and read on. Do you need to know it? You can go and look at the graph and that you can produce if you want to argue into it. For this essay can be very theoretical if you take it on that point, but just makes sense in you if you're gonna go very graphical for it. I'm not expecting you to go graphically. I'm expecting you just try to explain this in terms of wording. And then we go on to the other idea of cheap labor and social dumping. Reasons for protectionism. So this idea is coming from developed countries. It's an argument from developed countries. They are saying, well, developing countries, they have very cheap labor and we can't compete with this. So we want to impose a tariff on these products which have this cheap labor in order for us to compete. This is the argument. What is the reality of this matter? So I usually pause here for that reason that I'm waiting for someone to answer me. But the reality of this matter is this wages and this low wages that developing countries are paying is a reflection of their productivity. So the low wages is saying there is low productivity for for these laborers and that. So they are not producing. This one laborer in a developing country is not producing as much as one coming from a developing country. So it's not that they're paying low wages and that, it's actually that is making it uncompetitive. The production, which is also as slow because of um, the low productive worker, is the reflection of the wages, and therefore it's not really making their product cheaper in that sense because they cannot produce the same amount. Anyways, this is what they call social dumping. Trying to where your resource factors of production costs are held as cheap as possible, so that you can get some unfair advantage in terms of competing internationally and that. So this is where we're sitting at. There's no such thing as very difficult, as we find many a times that low cost to factors of production, low rentals and low wages is usually a factor of showing that it's just the productiveness of these factors production is low. This is different from where you hear the concept of dumping going around. Social dumping is totally different, huh? When they talk about dumping in general, and this is off topic, dumping is referring to the product where you're taking your product and dumping onto international shores or on another country, and you making this product so cheap that the local product cannot compete with this product and will never be able to compete with this product, forcing that local product or that local firm who's producing the product to go bankrupt, and then you winning the market. So that happens. That is what some countries do. They dump a product on the shores for dirt cheap to win the market, even if it means them taking a loss. Just because once the company is not producing, they can jack up their prices because there's no competition that they face. And then to the last thing, employment policy. So, as you would remember from the tariffs that we discussed at the trade policy and under industrial policy, that when you impose a tariff from partial equilibrium side, imposing a tariff means that local production would increase, meaning employment would increase. So this is the factor now when they're dealing with that is going to be argued now. So it says we have unemployment. We want to impose protectionism by imposing a tariff so that we can reach full employment. Remember, this point of view is only from a partial equilibrium perspective, but this is the point we're going to take from that perspective. You're going to see now when you start limiting the full models and that they're going to argue anything if you're not taking everything into perspective. But anyways, so you impose this tariff to increase local production and therefore help with reducing unemployment. So the problem with this is you're going to expect some form of retaliation. So you need to find another means of fighting this retaliation. Also, something you need to consider that when you increase your tariffs, that based on the condition multiplier, you expect the propensity to import to decline, and when that decline is experienced by the propensity to import, the multiplier usually increases. So after you impose the protectionism and you get your increased employment, the country now which you have imposed this tariff on, they're going to retaliate. So you need to come up with a means to avoid this. How does this country feel it? Usually now, because they're importing less, the income to this foreign company, all these countries in which you impose a tariff, is going to decrease. And if as they so we have their income decreasing in the rest of the world, and now they're going to retaliate. So you want to fix this economic problem before say anything worsens. So what is your response? So your response could be, by imposing this protectionism, is to apply an expansionary fiscal policy or monetary policy. So when you apply those two policies, they help combat the effect of your tariff increase. So any expansion of fiscal policy or monetary policy would help combat that. And you can read up this in your macro, and there's a graph here that explains it. And you're welcome to go and read on the theory about that. So, and the idea of increasing employment, expansion fiscal, and a monetary policy will help to combat that. There is another idea you can go with expansion fiscal policy or monetary policy. Devaluation of your currency will also help combat the effects of expansion fiscal and monetary policy. But for the cause of our tariff increases that we're trying to discuss, is that using expansion fiscal or monetary policy will help combat that to avoid retaliation from the foreign country. So this is the graph. Go and read about it. I'm not looking for you to produce and discuss it. You're assuming a vertical BP curve, that's more of a macro thing. Just understand that for these four reasons, the four things that we discussed about infant industries, cheap labor concept, about demand and supply conditions, and lastly, for as an employment policy, you need to be able to discuss all four of these factors when I ask you for reasons for applying a import tariff or for protectionism in any case. And then we move on to the infant industry for Michael Tribe, and he's a whole discussion paper in that. This one has a lot of graphs and a lot of discussions. I'm going to break this up into pieces and do it for you.